So I'm working on a project that requires some wooden cylinders that have to fit inside each other with some pretty tight tolerances. I maybe could have done this on the lathe, but I'm not that great of a turner, so I thought I would make a table saw jig. For the jig, I started by measuring the distance between the two miter slots on my table saw, which turned out to be exactly 12 inches, with the blade right in the middle of that. I cut a piece of plywood 14 inches wide so I'd have a 1-inch overhang on each side of the miter slots. I need to make some runners that go in these miter slots and fit tightly, so I started by measuring them. On a saw stop, it turns out they're exactly 3/4 of an inch wide. I also needed to measure the depth, and what I got was 27/64, so I just decreased that to a more round number of 3/8. I don't actually want my runners to bottom out inside the miter tracks anyway. I had this piece of scrap poplar, which very conveniently was already the exact right width for the slots. I ripped a 3/8 inch wide strip off of it, and then I trimmed it into two pieces that were the same length as my piece of plywood I cut earlier. Because my jig's going to end up being 14 inches wide and I want the blade to be right in the middle of it, I set my rip fence to 7 inches. I lowered the blade to get it out of the way, and then I checked the fit of my runners. One of them had to be sanded a little bit to get a better fit. The key is to get a nice tight side-to-side fit, but you also want the runner to be able to move freely within the miter slot. The next step's going to involve some glue, and I really didn't want to get any of it onto the cast iron, which would cause rust, so I put down some packing tape to protect the surface of the table saw. And I trimmed and folded over the tape on the edges of both miter slots. I cut up some spacers out of some 2mm thick plywood that I had left over from a laser cut project. The goal here is to have the runner standing just a little bit proud of the surface of the table saw just during the glue up. The goal is to make sure you have good contact between the runners and the piece of plywood. Here you can see how the runners are standing just a little bit proud of the table saw surface. I put a little bead of wood glue on both runners and then set the plywood on top right up against the edge of that rip fence that's set to 7 inches. Then I threw on some heavy stuff to serve as clamping pressure till that glue dried. After the glue dried and I removed the weight, tape, and spacers from the table saw, I checked and my sled had a nice tight fit, but it still moved freely. For the next step, I had to take the riving knife out, which I wouldn't normally recommend, but it's really the only way to do this. With the jig in place and the saw running, I slowly raised the blade up. I'll increase the size of this cut more later, but right now I'm doing it just to reference the exact dead center of the blade with relation to this jig. With the blade down and the saw off, I extended the center line of that cut to both sides of the jig. These lines will help with alignment later on. I needed to know how high the center of my axis for my jig was going to be, and so I measured the height of my blade, taking into account the 1/2-inch thick piece of plywood. 2.5 inches above the plywood is my max blade extension, so I needed to make sure that the center axis was higher than that. So with that measurement in mind, I cut up some more scrap plywood to make the axle holders for my jig. I laid everything out so that the very center point of the axle that will go through whatever I'm turning will be more than 1 inch above the maximum blade height. I did this because there's going to be bearings, threaded rod, nuts, and washers, and I don't want to have any metal come in contact with the blade. I used some double-sided tape to hold two pieces together because these are a matched pair and I wanted to make sure everything was exactly the same. I put a small hole all the way through so I'd know exactly where the center point was on the other side, and then I extended a line to the bottom, which will facilitate alignment later. This was 100% unnecessary, but I added a little shaping and curves to the top. Next, I used a Forstner bit to make the recesses for the bearings. With that done, I then split the two pieces apart and completed drilling the hole that the threaded rod will go all the way through. These bearings are going to have a threaded rod spinning through them, so they're not really going to function as a bearing should, but a metal-on-metal surface is better than a threaded rod spinning in a wood hole. I only had some fairly large construction screws on hand, so I added some pilot holes for the next step. Each piece that holds a bearing was then screwed onto another part to create sort of an L-shaped bracket. I took care on this jig to make sure that any screw that I used was positioned in such a place that it would never hit the table saw blade. I knew from having tried something sort of like this once before where I made a much more half-assed jig that having a handle on it would be a nice thing, so I cut that out next. I threw a little round over on the edge of the handle so it'd be nicer to use. I lined up the centerline marks on my axle holders that I had made with that centerline mark on the jig platform. Taking the time to make sure those marks were there made lining everything up perfectly straight quite easy. I also laid out where I thought the best spot for the handle would go, and as it turned out, it was pretty good. All these parts were both glued and then screwed from the bottom, so I needed to make sure everything was countersunk enough that the metal would not drag on the table saw surface. I didn't include footage of screwing on both axle holders because it got a little repetitive, but there's one on each side of the jig to make sort of a mirror image of each other. I'm also going to acknowledge that using glue and screws was a little bit overkill. One or the other would have been fine. I definitely didn't want the bearings falling out during operation, and I had these little metal plates in a parts drawer. I don't even know what they were from, but I used them to make little bearing keepers, and it worked out great. Before I could say construction was done, there was one last thing to do, and that was to fully elongate the cut hole. I left some material from the platform on both ends. I could have gone all the way through because the brackets were high enough, but I don't think I made them beefy enough to do that. For my initial test on this jig, I used this blank that I had already glued up. When I glued it up, it turned out it was too small for the project I'm actually working on, so it became the test piece. I need to be able to tightly fit the threaded rod in there, so to do that I had to make some bushings. There are more than a few ways I could think of to make bushings for this, but the laser cutter is by far the fastest and most precise. I made two small discs with 1/2-inch holes in them that will fit inside the blank, and then two larger discs that will form sort of a flange when glued together. All these have to do is stay together, so I just used some CA glue with activator to make it quick. So these two little bushings gave me a really nice tight fit on the axle for my first test, and I learned on the third test, and I'll show that later, that this is actually really important. There's a lot of different ways you could make a blank to spin on something like this, but the most important thing is that it fits tightly on the axle. So here I'm using some 1/2-inch thick threaded rod with some nuts and washers to hold everything together. You need to have the threaded rod and the blank positioned in such a way that there's no way that the threaded rod could come out of one of the axle holders. So here's my first test of this jig, and I'm going to show the entire thing in true speed. With the saw running, I raised the blade up slowly and at the same time started spinning the blank. Because my blank's not really that big, I didn't have to move the jig very far on the table saw itself. Some of the movement was done just within the threaded rod and those axle holders. And once the table saw blade teeth started making contact with the spinning turning blank, I tried not to raise the blade more than 1/8 of an inch in any single go. I think I exceeded that 1/8 of an inch a little bit on this pass, but having done this a few times now, I definitely recommend raising the blade in very small increments. And I'm going to take a moment to mention that while this probably looks more dangerous than it is, like most things involving power tools, it is still dangerous, and if you choose to do this, you're doing it at your own risk. So here's what I ended up with after my first test. First off, obviously there was a huge mess. The nature of this jig kind of takes all dust collection out of the window. Second, my surface seemed kind of rough. I was using a Forest Woodworker 2, which is an excellent all-around blade, but I wanted to see what would happen if I put a really high-tooth finishing blade on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the nature of this jig requires you to take the riving knife off, so if you do this, be sure before you use the saw again for normal function, you put that riving knife back on. It's probably the single most important safety device on the entire table saw. Now, what I learned on this test was probably a lot more important than answering the question of whether or not a really high-tooth blade gave a better finish. You'll see what happens. The nuts that held the turning blank tightly had loosened up, allowing it to fall onto the blade. Luckily, this was a test piece, so it wasn't really a waste, and it allowed me to learn that in the future, jam nuts would always be used. Now, as far as which blade gave a better finish, I think that the higher tooth finishing blade was marginally better than the ripping or combination blade. No matter what though, sanding like this was still going to be required, and that's fine. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the entire reason I'm doing this is because I'm working on a project that requires some pretty consistent tolerances. and I was able to get very consistent 54mm diameter on this tube the entire way down. For my second test, I'm going to make an actual cylinder, and this is something that I did with many segmented rings and a flush cut bit on the router to kind of form it all the way down. You can see on one end there's still the template I glued on, and I just did this step by step, glue one on, let it dry, trim the inside, glue one on, let it dry, trim the inside, and that's how I made the perfectly round inside. Now this time I again made some very tightly fitting bushings for either side, and I used jam nuts on both sides so I could get them really tight in a way that they would not come loose. Due to how awkward this was to do, and I think that that's pretty well demonstrated, if I ever made another jig like this in the future, I would make one of the axle holders removable. I think that would have made this step a lot easier. So my second test went a bit smoother than the first one did. I did everything basically the same and was able to turn a very nice clean cylinder with no incidents. Having already done this once, I did upgrade my eye protection to include a face shield, and I put on a sweatshirt to try and keep some of the sawdust off my clothes. This is a very messy process, and I have seen a version of this jig that included kind of a box that went around to collect all the dust, but I wanted to be able to see everything that was happening, so I didn't do that on my jig. One thing I did learn is to try and hold the drill upside down so it doesn't hit the fence rail. This makes it so you can get full travel on the jig. This was my third test with the largest diameter cylinder that I've shown so far. It's sort of hard to tell, but if you look at the drill and the jig itself, you can see that it's spinning off balance. The wobbling is even more apparent here in the slow-mo. I didn't even notice this until I reviewed the footage, but if you look at the side of the jig, it's jumping pretty considerably. This wobble also left a pretty bad and uneven finish on the cylinder. So what happened was I sort of half-assed the bushings for this one, and each of them had about 1 millimeter of play in it. I cut new ones and made sure they were very tightly fitting. The new bushings ended up fixing about 90% of the issue. I also figured it wouldn't hurt to set the drill to low speed. Those two things seem pretty effective at preventing the wobble in a dry run. The fix worked well on the real run as well, though it's hard to tell here because on the first pass I was getting the cylinder back to a proper round shape. Another one of my impressions is that it's important to keep the cylinder spinning at a fairly constant speed, and if it's a somewhat slower speed, that's good, especially the bigger the diameter of the cylinder you're trying to turn. Here in slow motion you can see that the cylinder isn't really wobbling at all. Now I made this jig from scraps and bits of hardware that I had laying around, but if I was going to do the entire thing all over, I would have made that rod something thicker than 1/2 inch, like 5/8, 3/4, maybe even 1 inch thick to make it as rigid as possible. At 1/2 inch, I think it just still had a little bit too much give in it. Well, with that being said, this is about the biggest cylinder that I think I'm going to have to turn for this project, and it came out really well. As you can see though, I could probably increase the diameter of this cylinder by about 4 inches and I'd still be able to turn it with this jig. As you can see, here are my two finished cylinders, and the inner one fits inside the outer one perfectly. The wall thicknesses are also very consistent, which is nice. Now, while I know I could have turned these on a lathe, I don't think I would have been able to achieve such tight tolerances. I'm just not that good at it. As it was, this jig took a couple hours to make, and it was really easy to use. I used these cylinders for a prototype of my next project, which will also be the subject of my next video, which I'll hopefully have done in 3 or 4 weeks. And as always, if you got this far, thanks for watching.